All right, so I wonder if you have noticed a pattern that's emerging in our study of epistemology. The pattern is this, is that typically before somebody lays out for us their particular theory of knowledge, they first answer some really basic metaphysical questions for us. They lay out to us their responses to what exists, how do those things exist, what's the nature of reality, how is reality structured. And it makes sense that they would do this, right? That if you're going to lay out a theory for how you think we come to know things, you'd have to first establish the features of the domain in which this knowledge acquisition is occurring. In other words, I have to know something about the rules of the game and how reality is structured before I can start to play the game, before I can start to acquire knowledge about my existence in reality. Now, there's a little bit of a chicken-egg problem here, right? Because in order for me to explain to you what I think is true about the nature of reality, I would first have to have a theory of knowledge. Otherwise, how could I come to know things about reality? On the other hand, I can't really have a theory of reality until I first understand the features of the domain in which I'm operating, the arena in which I'm operating. So there's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem there. But ignore that for now. And instead, focus on this. What are some fundamental assumptions that you have about the nature of your experiences and the reality in which these experiences occur? What would be some fundamental assumptions that you feel comfortable making about the domain in which you exist, the reality in which you exist? So for example, you start thinking about things like, is reality outside of myself the way it appears to me, or is it different? Is it more likely that I'm in a simulation, or am I actually experiencing real life? Do I have free will, or is it an illusion? Okay, so think about some of those really basic questions about the way that reality is structured, because eventually we're going to want to put you in a position where you have your own theory of knowledge. And it'll be easier to do that if you've got some assumptions about reality that you feel very confident or comfortable assuming. Okay, so I'm not asking you to necessarily come up with knowledge about reality. I'm asking you initially, think of some things that you assume to be true about reality, that you feel comfortable assuming to be true. And then we'll see if that leads us to be able to develop our own theory of knowledge. All right, so our next empiricist, Master John Locke. Boy, it's hard to overstate his influence on not just Western philosophy, but Western civilization. John Locke is regarded as a profoundly important Enlightenment thinker. He is along with John Stuart Mill, largely responsible for advancing the idea of liberalism. And when I say that, I don't mean the kind of liberalism, political liberalism that you would associate with like the Democratic Party in America. I mean more liberty, the idea of people being free and what a free society would look like and what kinds of things have to be in place for a society to be free. So he is very responsible for the kind of culture of freedom that we experience in modern day America. He's also, you can actually see his ideas kind of woven right into the fabric of our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, this idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was a ripoff from Locke, who some number of years before, many years before, wrote that human beings have an innate right to life, liberty, and property. So John Locke's a major heavy hitter. He's also in culture and politics, but he's also a major heavy hitter in philosophy as well, because John Locke wrote an essay called, it's actually a book, an essay concerning human understanding. And in this, he lays out how he believes we come to have ideas. How it is that we come to have knowledge, and what exactly ideas are, and what it means to experience ideas. And again, like these other things, I feel like I'm being hyperbolic here, but this particular work by Locke was monumentally influential on other philosophers like George Berkeley and David Hume and Immanuel Kant and a whole host of others. Okay, and like the other epistemologists we've looked at, Locke begins with a kind of method for determining a starting point. In other words, if he knows that if he is going to lay out for you how it is that we come to acquire knowledge, that he first has to establish some fundamental assumptions that he believes are true. Okay, and one of those assumptions has to do with Occam's razor. So William Occam, or William of Occam, was I think he was a 12th century monk, and he had this idea about, it was an assumption. He had this assumption about how we should situate ourselves towards ideas and explanations of things. And it was called, or is called, the principle of parsimony, economy or succinctness. Now we just call it Occam's razor. And it says essentially, what can be done in fewer terms is done in vain with more. What does that mean? It means, think back to the sock grabber. Given competing hypotheses, the hypothesis with the fewest assumptions that adequately explains should be selected. In other words, if you're looking at an event that occurred, or you're looking at something that exists, and there's different explanations that you can come up with for why the socks went missing from the washer and the dryer, or why a particular event has occurred, and you have a number of different explanations for these, choose the one that requires the least amount of assumptions and work on your part. Okay, so this principle that Locke is assuming is a smart one to assume, has been known by different names, right? We might know it in our culture not as the principle of parsimony, but as keep it simple, stupid, KISS, which really says something about sort of our culture. But keep it simple, stupid. That's Occam's razor. Or as Einstein said, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. In other words, yes, go for the simplest explanation, but it can't be inadequate. It can't leave any loose ends. The simplest explanation has to adequately explain the event or the phenomenon that you are attempting to explain. So how does this work in action? Well, sort of like the sock grabber. Maybe you have an experience where you're walking down the street and you find a $20 bill on the ground, and you're like, boss, this is cool. I like free money. I found this. Now, how did this happen? How did it happen that I came across this $20 bill? Why am I so fortunate? Why am I so lucky? Well, one explanation might be that it's all because you're awesome, and some karmic force or God has chosen to reward you for your awesomeness. The entire universe kind of operated in such a way as to put that $20 bill in front of your path as a way of saying, you rock. That's one explanation. It's also possible, though, that it's not God or karma. It's the TV show Jackass. And they are secretly filming you. And they have placed this $20 bill in your path, hoping that you'll reach down to grab it, and then they'll yank it away right at that last minute to make you look like a bit of a tool. That's a possibility, right? Of course, it's also possible that somebody just dropped it and you found it. Now, all three of these, they all adequately explain how you've come across this $20 bill, right? But think about the number of assumptions that are built in to the first one, right? In order to accept that the first one is true, that it's God or some karmic force that's done this, you would have to first establish the existence of that God or that karmic force. And that's a pretty tall order. In fact, that's a taller order than establishing that it's Jackass filming you, right? Because I actually saw a Jackass episode where they did exactly this with a fishing line and a $20 bill. So between those two first options, they both explain how I've come across this $20 bill, but it's way easier for me to establish that it's Jackass that is involved or that is responsible for this, and that's way easier to accept than God or a karmic rewarder. It involves the least number of assumptions. I shouldn't say it's easier. It involves me having to assume less. Okay, but of course the last option also has me assuming a lot less than the karmic or God explanation, and it also has me assuming a lot less than the Jackass explanation. So as long as that option adequately explains my experience of encountering this errant $20 bill, Occam's razor says I should go with that one. Now, that doesn't mean that in fact I'm not being cosmically rewarded for my awesomeness. That's still perfectly possible. But until I have good reason for accepting the assumptions that such a claim would be based on, Occam is saying, and Einstein is saying, go with this last one. All right, so this is Locke's starting point with epistemology. He says, okay, if I'm going to lay out a theory of knowledge for you and explain how it is you come to acquire knowledge, I first have to establish some things that I think are true about human beings and the domain in which they operate. And so then he looks back at rationalists like Plato, and he thinks about how Plato has laid out the domain in which we operate, right? His theory of forms, that their reality is dual in its nature, and there exist these non-material forms in this whole other world, the intelligible world. And then there are these particulars down in the material world. Think about all the assumptions that involves. Think about Descartes' idea of perfection, right? Descartes having the idea of perfection was something that he had to assume was given to him by a perfect being, God, in order for him to believe he could have any other kind of knowledge. But again, think about how much that requires us to also assume. It requires us to assume that such a being, such a perfect being, actually exists. Think about all that's required of us to assume is true if we accept Descartes' idea that we're both a physical and a non-physical being. Primarily, essentially, a non-physical being, a thinking things. Think about all that requires about what we would have to assume to be true about the ability of non-physical things to interact with physical things. Think about the suspension of so much that we know about physical laws that we would have to assume we're wrong about in order for Descartes' thinking to work. And so Locke says, so don't accept any of that. I have a simpler explanation. Locke says, all knowledge is a posteriori. In other words, all knowledge begins with experience, or it's connected to experience. The experiences that we have of things provide us with sense data, and that sense data is what we turn into our mental experiences, and this is how we come to have knowledge. We come into the world not with innate ideas, but as tabula rasa, or a blank slate. And when we start to have experiences, those write on that blank slate, creating knowledge. So think about the question I asked you in your thought primer. Imagine that you were born without any senses. You couldn't smell anything, taste anything, feel anything, see anything. What would you think about? What thoughts would you have? What ideas could you have? What kinds of knowledge could you have? Okay, and Locke is saying the fact that you can't really think of anything is an indication that he's right, and he's safe in assuming that we come into the world as blank slates. And it's only as we begin to have experience that we begin to collect data about the domain in which we're operating in. And as we collect that data, we have these mental experiences, and then we can start to have knowledge. Okay? So this is Locke's starting point. We come into the world like a blank slate, we start to have experiences, and it's at that point that we start to acquire knowledge. Now we need to look at, well, what exactly does that knowledge look like, Locke?